And I'm sharing.
It's bizarre.
Yeah.
Like
Hello, my name is Chad Nelson, and I'm going to talk to you today about how everything old is new again and again. What we could have learned from a book on Cobol from 1976, but we didn't learn. The slides are up at chads.space/Cobol if you want to follow along. This looked nicer on my browser. So a little bit about me. My name is Chad Nelson. I am the technology team manager for the publishing, archives, and digitization team at California Digital Library. I've been there for about 3 months. But pretty new. My team supports, among many other things, Calisphere, which is the aggregation of digital collections for California, for the state of California, with about over 2 million items. Wait, no, 2 million, yeah, sorry. It's on 3 months, I forget. Anyway, so a lot. And then eScholarship, which is the open source, open access publication platform and institutional repository for the UC system, which has 35 million objects in it, a very large number, and many other things. So, but I am not going to talk to you about that because we don't support any Cobol. Instead, I'm going to talk to you about this book called Cobol with Style, Principles of Good Programming with Numerous Examples to Improve Programming Style and Proficiency. I loved this book just for the cover itself. It was like an old Victorian guidebook on how to improve yourself, like a title page. So I loved it from the start. I found this book at a random general store in Madrid, New Mexico, which is halfway between Albuquerque and Santa Fe, along what's called the Turquoise Trail. At the time, I thought it was the free bookshelf. I realized later it was actually the go in and pay shelf, but I just walked off with it because I was intrigued by the book. It caught my eye, and I was like, I don't know anything about Cobol. This looks cool. I will check it out. So the book is in the Programming Proverbs series, which there's quite a few of these that came out mid to late 70s. Started with just programming proverbs and then went to various other languages, including Cobol. This is the one I happened upon. I like random chance, and so I'm going with this one. It was written by 2 authors, Louis Chmura and Henry F. Ledgard. I couldn't find a picture of them. It was from the 70s. I assume this is what they looked like at the time. And yeah, they both contributed to the series. So you may be asking yourself, why? Why would you care about Cobol? Why would you care about this book about Cobol? And why are there all these pictures of people in terrible 70s outfits? This is a book about style from the 70s. I had to include 70s style in my slides. So that's the answer to the last question. Now, the other question is, how many of you have worked with Cobol in your life? Have programmed or supported Cobol? I'm seeing 0 for all our viewers on the live stream. No one raised their hand. So why would anyone care about Cobol if none of us use it? I've never used it. I've never touched it. And I think the answer to that question is, comes down to when I read this book, the proverbs that it's filled with still felt really, really modern. And I found that was really interesting. I was surprised by how much I still felt was really relevant. And then I also think it's really interesting to think about technology, not just as this abstract thing, this kind of like that exists, ahistorically. It's always in a context. There's a reason a technology made sense at its time. And understanding that is a really useful kind of tool in the toolkit of anyone who's working with technological systems. And finally, this kind of like got me thinking about what I don't know, I've kind of called it a genealogy of software ideas, where, things that we take for granted now as, the rules of why we program a certain way, whether it be agile or, the things that you learned in clean code or pragmatic programmer have a history. And they evolved from something else. And they were, in some ways created before and then recreated again and again and again. And I'm really interested in this idea of trying to think about why we do what we do as programmers, as technologists, but not just in this like, this is the pure way to write code, but in the like, oh, this makes sense because of what we are doing right now and what our needs are. So that's why. And the other good reason about these 70s style in all my slides is that when I first started, I thought, oh, that 70s style is hideous, which is how I thought this book was going to be. I thought, oh, all the recommendations are going to be hideous. To my surprise, it wasn't. And so there's this nice juxtaposition between the awful styles of the 1970s and the quite nice style of the book's Proverbs. So let's get to the Proverbs themselves. I'm going to do a few at a time. So the first one was don't panic. And I love that this was the first proverb because the authors really got to the point of writing software is a psychological process. It's a human process, an emotional process sometimes. And that's the most important thing. Get yourself in a good place. Don't freak out because you've got a deadline or because somebody's pushing you or because you've never worked with this before. Stay calm, relax. I can't tell you how many times I've given this advice to like new developers, junior developers that I've been mentoring. I'm like, look, I know it seems like this is like black magic, why this thing is working the way it is, and you feel like you'll never figure it out, but you'll get there. Just stay calm, work through it, and you'll get it. And I think that's really great advice, and I loved that it started with that. And that's what kind of really hooked me in. And then the second one is start with the documentation early. We're still fighting these fights with so many developers about getting people to write documentation. It's hard. It's hard to make time, but they really talk about how important it is. And then the third one here is think first, code later. And again, the idea of planning what you're going to do before you do it, not just sitting down and starting to write code, but really giving it some thought and thinking about why you're going to build what you're going to build, how you're going to build it, how you're going to approach it. Again, is always absolutely sage advice for doing software development. So I loved that these aren't new ideas. These have been around for a long time in software development, and software is a craft. So I was so excited to see it. So next, we'll get to what they call proceed top down. And this is kind of like throughout the book, they have this approach that they want to really evangelize top down programming. It's very structured, very logical. Like you start at the top, you get your high level outline, and then you build all the small pieces within it. But they want you to think about the whole process from beginning to end before you do it. And I'll talk more later about the issues with that. And, like we all probably hear that and think waterfall or something like that. And I think there's, the context of how the software is being written and tested and used gives them, there's a reason that they did it that way. But what I do want to do is get in a little bit to like what they put in their ideas of proceeding top down, even if it isn't totally relevant. They said design in levels. So break your code up into smaller pieces. Use initial language independence, write pseudocode first before you start actually doing the implementation. Again, something I do almost every time I write code. Postpone the details to the lower levels. Again, breaking things down, encapsulating your the logic of the real details. Formalization of each level, verification of each level. They're a little bit kind of Cobol specific, but they're very much about kind of defining your inputs and outputs before you start going down to the next level, so you know what you've got above it. And then the verification is test at each level, essentially, so you get bugs at the appropriate level, followed by successive refinement. So iterate, iterate, iterate. So again, all these things that we still talk about, we still see blog posts about, and probably whole books published on, the idea's been around for a long time, and that was surprising to me. And I think the fact that it was surprising to me is it says a lot, as much about me as anyone else, but I think it is kind of a common thing to think these are more modern ideas. So some more proverbs. There was 19 of them total. Beware other approaches. So in this one, they were saying, don't even try these non-top-down, ways of programming. They're terrible. And I don't really agree with that. But what I really liked was that they also outlined these 3 other approaches, like a bottom-up approach, where you write the details first, and then you work your way out to the larger structure. Or the inside-out approach, where you start somewhere in the middle, halfway between the lowest details and the biggest structure, and you instantiate something first, and then you work up and work down at the same time as you kind of build out a structure. Or a linear one, where you start with what's going to be evaluated first and what's going to run first all the way through the end. And what I found interesting about this was that I've never consciously thought about naming those approaches to writing software before. I've never thought about thinking about my own process in that way of oh, that's like a whole approach. And sometimes it's really useful. Sometimes it makes sense to, if you don't know at the lowest level detail how something's going to work, whether it's even worth it to build a whole structure around it, why wouldn't you start there? Or if you kind of understand the structure and kind of understand the details, but there's something in the middle that you really don't, that's what you want to figure out first. That's often the way I do it, is take that kind of inside out, or they call it the forest approach. Same for linear, when I'm writing a data workflow or something like that, I'll often write that way. So I just like the way they kind of laid out, again, thinking about how you're writing code and thinking about your process and naming it. And I don't know, it wasn't an epiphany for me, but it was definitely a oh, I do those different things at different times, and it's useful, again, a useful toolbox just to name it. So the next parts were code in modular units. Obviously, an incredibly modern thing to be doing. So this book came out in '76. This is maybe 8-10 years after what was called structured programming was really kind of popularized by Dijkstra and others. 10 years after the first kind of object-oriented languages were coming out. So it's not brand new in this book, but those ideas have been around a long time. And again, there's still so much publication about how to modularize your work, how to build things in this way. So I was excited to see that. Plan for change. This essentially boiled down to don't repeat yourself, but in the Cobol instance, it's in the Cobol context, it's more about defining variables rather than hard coding values, simple things. But again, the idea was still there of don't repeat yourself, make it easy for changes to happen, find, for whatever you're working in, find ways to make change happen because it's going to happen. And then prepare to prove the pudding, which I loved, was for in this context, it's about sticking debugging code into your actual program so that you can actually get the data out and see what was happening. And for a Cobol program that they're talking about, that they're writing, where they have to write the code and then put it on a punch card and then run it through a machine and then load several tapes to get to the data. It's a very long, involved process. And if you have to rerun it again, it's not like our modern interpreted languages or even, compiled languages where you get much faster feedback. It was a slow process. So, they were talking about essentially instrument in your code, in your actual production code, ways to find out what's happening inside it. It's a very modern idea, even if it takes a different flavor, a different shape, even if they describe it differently in the book. So, and then, they get to things that are, again, coming back to not just about how code can run most efficiently, but how can it be best understood? So pretty, use white space to make your code readable. Again, the thing we still all fight with, and now we have automated linters, hopefully, to do that. But, these ideas have been around that it's helpful. Comment effectively. The flame war about comments lie, no, they don't, they're useful, has been around as long as programming, it seems, because you will always find these kind of they talk quite a bit about how there's much debate about whether or not you should use comments or not in your code. So that has never stopped. use mnemonic words, so name your variables intelligently. Don't leave the reader in the dust. Don't overcomplicate your code to be more clever or faster or shorter, just to get your code golf score up or whatever it is. Like if someone can't understand it and read it and look at it, they're lost. I mean, again, how many times do we talk about how I know this is a thing I talk to developers about a lot, is you might write this code once, but you're going to read it many, many times, and other people are going to read it many, many times. And you need to optimize for that, because again, it's about finding ways to change it. And you can only really safely change code when you understand what it's doing. So those ideas are not new, and then finally, I love that they have someone else read your work. Code reviews. It is, again, not a new thing. It's a thing they've been asking, has been a part of a process, a recommendation here for years and years. So read the manual again. I really like this. This is one I never consciously thought about. But the idea here is like basically, okay, so you finished the project, got it all done, delivered, did it the top-down approach, and it's working perfectly. Now go back and read the manual to see what did you just implement that is already actually in the language. What features were there that you didn't understand the problem space well enough yet to know you needed to use those features. But now you do, and when you go back and read that manual, you're going to understand it better. And again, I love that it gets back to this, like the psychological aspect of programming, the human emotional aspect of we get locked in our ways of thinking, we get locked in our kind of like approaches, and you need to give yourself space to learn and to grow, and kind of recommending, hey, this is a great time to go do that. I loved. And finally, don't be afraid to start over. Sometimes you got to throw your code away and start over. And again, this is about not being afraid of failure, not being afraid of like making mistakes and getting something wrong. And I think it's great that this book about Cobol, which is like a very business focused language, had all these kind of like very human centric approaches to writing the code and how to write it best. So I find that absolutely, I found those kind of fascinating. Now, why do I really, really like this book? What do I enjoy about it? I love how modern it is. I was so surprised by how much the kind of recommendation in the Proverbs felt like they could have come from Clean Code or Pragmatic Programmer or any of these blog posts, in the last 5, 10, 15 years, because we're still trying to teach that. And I loved it, but I was also really surprised about how modern it felt, because I felt like, I didn't know code was like that. I didn't know there was the craft around that, the ideas of code around that had been around that long. And that's my own, failure as maybe to go back and read the history. But I don't know, I went and reread parts of Clean Code for this. And there's no mention of like anything older than XP and Agile Manifesto. Like they don't go back to. There's one paragraph where they mention Dijkstra, the kind of structured programming, pioneer kind of from the late 60s. And it's basically dismissive, like, oh, well, he writes really long functions, so that doesn't matter at all. It was really just, and I think in some ways it's a symptom of tech, a love of the new, and always being like, this old thing, it's garbage, we don't need it. That's the old way to do it. And I think that's, and I think it really clouds our judgment, and we lose so much knowledge that was there before because something seems like hard to understand or no longer feels completely relevant. And so this kind of takes me to my next point about how what I really like is the way that it made me think about technology in context. So there was some of these proverbs that don't make sense anymore, like the top-down approach, and they also had a thing about defining your entire problem and all the work you're going to do beforehand before you write it, before you write any of the program, which again sounds like waterfall. And to me, like I do Agile, waterfall, that's terrible. But again, it made sense in the context where it was so expensive to make a mistake and to have to get back to, you can't just quickly iterate on your code. You have to be a little bit more careful. So I really like the way that kind of context brings out why decisions were made. Like they have so many really good proverbs in here. Why would just a couple of these be trash? Like we've moved on from that. I think appreciating that why they made those choices when they made them, and that they were good choices and they were doing the best, helps us think about what our own choices that we're going to make. Because I think one place where technologists of all levels fail is to correctly assess the context in which some new piece of technology will be useful. So like, does my small library of 2 people that I work at need to adopt a, Kubernetes, for example, like they're like, well, I saw a blog post on it and I saw a presentation on it and I saw that, and for some, it absolutely makes sense. But for others, if you're not asking the question of like, well, who is this? In what context does it make sense? In what context is it useful? Do we have the team to support it? I think it's the same type of thing of thinking about something where you are not in that context and you don't understand the context in which something was created. So you see something, in this case, you're thinking, oh, that's great, it really worked for them, I want to go there. And in the case of like Cobol, you're thinking, oh, that's a terrible idea, I don't want to do that. But it's that same kind of lacking the context before you kind of make a decision whether something's useful or not, or there's something valuable in it. So I think I found that like as an interesting way to kind of think about the value in looking at these kind of old programming languages and old technologies, because it kind of helped me put me in that space of thinking about things in that way. And then the last part is, I think there's this idea of, like I said, kind of a genealogy of software ideas that, kind of going back to that waterfall idea. As I was reading this book, I was, seeing their approaches and seeing how they were very waterfall, but then seeing what kind of Agile was responding to. I could see why people didn't like that. And when they had the opportunity to they didn't have the constraints anymore of the slow compile time, the slow loading times, or needing to put something on a punch card, they wanted to move away from it. They wanted to break away from it. But I like to see that history, that kind of like it moved from one place to the next, and that Agile isn't just a good approach because it's like theoretically the platonic ideal of how to develop, but it makes sense for our current the affordances for the languages we have and the technology we have. And so it really contextualizes why we make the decisions we make and why we code or structure our work the way we do. So I find that I feel like there's so much more of this kind of like genealogy of software ideas that I'd love to go through. I've read a whole bunch of older programming language books now, but I'm really boring. This one is really fun. It was really kind of interesting, really weird as well. But I think there's a value in that, because there is so much drive within technology and software programming to go for the new, go for the Chinese, go for the thing that will make your life easier. But having that context around why you're doing it is really important. And I think this is one way to start thinking about it, by looking at things that used to work and no longer do, and trying to understand that. And so the only thing I want to leave you with here is that there's one more context about this book and about Cobol that I blew my mind. There's a part in this book where they give a long narrative explanation of how someone would go about implementing all these kind of recommendations and this top-down approach to writing software, to writing Cobol. And the ultimate goal of what they're trying to deliver at the end is they need to deliver to the president of this fictional country, who is also a general, the number of disloyal employees working in the copper mine that is owned by the state. So this gave me this whole other context about, if this is the only example you could come up with, what is the context of people that were writing Cobol at the time? Like, there's this whole, I couldn't, and I still can't understand how they wrote this, and then was so kind of kind about thinking about the psychological approach to programming and, you know, sharing your code and like getting other people to understand it. So there's this real disconnect there that I didn't know what to do with, and I needed you all to see it as well. So yeah, because I didn't want you thinking this book was just awesome through and through. There are definitely some weird parts, but I think there's a lot to learn from it. And so if you find an old programming book in a someplace random and you can buy it or steal it, as I did, you should do that, and you may discover something new about your own work today. Thank you.
Questions from the audience? How many numbers of disloyal employees?
I've never run the program myself, so I don't know how many of my employees are disloyal. I know you're watching.
So do you actually know Cobol now?
Oh, I spent about 15 minutes trying to set up a Cobol compiler on my no, I'm not gonna go there.
Yeah.
It's not a fun language to write, I have to say. So yeah, Dijkstra had some really awful things to say about Cobol that I will not repeat here because they're cruel.
Yeah, I think your experience of going back and looking at older books has really helped. I've done that. My first language was Pascal, and I always had an interest in Nicolas Burr and so I've been going back and thinking of this stuff, and it's interesting because so much of what, even when I went to engineering school, it was like this blind spot, anything before 1978. But it actually is relevant. And you think about the constraints. I mean, you're right about why top-down was big, why procedural programming was a big deal in the early 70s. I was in school much later. And it was because of tape machines. But we still have to think about I/O, right? It's not punch card and tape, it's network time, it's access time for the object store. So even though those problems are cast in a slightly different context, they still exist. And some of the solutions that existed before are not being really useful. And if you go through the literature, you can start seeing like, well, get invented here. We forgot, we reinvented it here. Sometimes not as good, sometimes better. We forgot, we reinvented it again. As a computing as a discipline, we've not learned to remember our past. And I think we're at a stage, computing gets off the ground in the 50s. And that's over half century away, maybe 3/4 of a century away. Time to start remembering. And I think there's a lot of useful solutions and weirdness. This is brilliant. I'm so glad you found that book.
Me too. It's been great. Quite a journey. All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'll let you stop recording.
Okay.